Welcome! You are standing in the doorway of the Mayflower Society House, an 18th century mansion of great beauty and dignity. Not only has this home seen 3 centuries of history, but it stands as a symbol of unity, acting as the national headquarters of the nonprofit organization, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. To belong to the society, you must prove your lineage from one of the 102 passengers who traveled across the Atlantic on the Mayflower in the year 1620. First built in 1754 by Pilgrim Edward Winslow's great-grandson of the same name, the Society House is perfectly situated on North Street overlooking Plymouth Rock and the harbor in which the original Plymouth settlement was established. The house has changed hands multiple times during the last 3 centuries and has undergone several renovations. The General Society of Mayflower Descendants, or GSMD, acquired the house in 1941 and have maintained the property since that time. We are excited to share the many stories and hidden treasures of the Mayflower Society House with you. In 1754, Edward Winslow, the great-grandson of Mayflower passenger Edward Winslow, built a 4-room house on the Plymouth waterfront. Those 4 rooms included this one, the room across the hall, and the 2 rooms directly above. The front half of the staircase you saw in the great entry is also original to the 1754 dwelling, and at that time the house sat 30 feet closer to the street. This room may have served as a dining room for the Winslow family. It features 18th century wood paneling and a fireplace which is thought to remain in its original location. The tiles which adorn the fireplace are Delft, a style of ceramic historically produced in Delfshaven, Holland. Delfshaven is the seaport from which many of the pilgrims first embarked for America. Look for tiles like these adorning each of the fireplaces in the house. This is a portrait of Pilgrim Edward Winslow, the great-grandfather of the original owner of this house. It was painted in London in 1651 and is the only known contemporary likeness of a Mayflower passenger. The original is on display at Pilgrim Hall Museum here in Plymouth. Mayflower passenger Edward Winslow was a prominent man in early Plymouth colony. He took part in some of the earliest explorations on Cape Cod, acted as a diplomat to the local Wampanoag people, and was the first Englishman to marry in New Plymouth when he wed Susanna White in the spring of 1621. Winslow also held political offices in the colony. He was several times chosen as magistrate or assistant to the governor, and on 3 occasions was himself elected to the role of governor. He also served as a business representative for the colony, making several journeys to England and back. In addition, Winslow was author of at least one contemporary account of the Pilgrims' first years in Plymouth, and much of what we know about the early years of the colony comes from his writings. Edward Winslow, great-grandson of the Mayflower passenger of the same name, was born in Marshfield, Massachusetts in 1714. In 1741, Edward married Hannah Howland, another Mayflower descendant, and together they had 5 children. Edward was a Harvard graduate, and during his residence in Plymouth served as Plymouth County First Magistrate, collector of His Majesty's Customs, registrar of the Court of Probate, and clerk of the Common Pleas and General Sessions of the Peace. This document, dated the 20th of November 1746, is an example of one of Winslow's duties as a government official. It is a summons to Sarah Richard of Plympton in the county of Plymouth to appear before the court of the General Sessions of the Peace to answer to the charge that she had, quote, absented herself from the public worship of God for more than the space of 1 month, contrary to law and an evil example to all others. At that time there was little separation of church and state, and absence from Sunday worship without reasonable cause was considered a grievous sin and violation of the law. Despite popular belief, early colonists in New England were not in favor of religious freedom or religious tolerance. Rather, like most Christians at that time, they believed that their manner of worship was the only correct one, and therefore it was the duty of the government to ensure every citizen was in conformity with those practices. To this end, the colonists retained English laws pertaining to the church, such as penalties for absence from worship, leaving parishioners, such as Sarah Richard, to answer to the court for their crimes. At the time of the American Revolution, Edward Winslow, owner of the home, was a Tory, or Loyalist, meaning he remained loyal to the British Crown and was opposed to the American Rebellion. In 1775, he refused to take the oaths of allegiance to the rebel governments and was consequently deprived of his public offices and revenue. In December of 1781, Edward and his family relocated to the garrison in New York City, then under British occupation. However, upon their removal, the whole of his property was sold. Edward's daughter, Sarah Winslow, later wrote of the experience.
Some time before our furniture was disposed of, I wrote to my mother requesting that the picture in our hall with the coat of arms that my sister and myself worked might be given to the care of a young lady for me. This week, a letter from the lady informs me that Colonel Warren sent a sheriff to her with orders that she must give oath that she had nothing in her possession belonging to our family. Not daring to take the oath, she gave up the article, and he had impudence enough to tell her that he took them for a debt, which he did not recollect when he took the other things. I do believe he is the completest devil that was ever suffered to live. That at this late hour he should be contriving ways to torment his benefactor is a masterpiece of wickedness. I have done with him never again to mention his name.
Sadly, Winslow never returned to New England, and in the twilight months of the war, he and his family joined the evacuation of New York City, sailing for a new home in Nova Scotia. Edward Winslow lived the remainder of his life there and died in Halifax in 1784. This is one of the 4 rooms original to the 1754 house, and like the others still features 18th century wood paneling. The society has decorated it as a parlor, since that was its use for much of the early 1800s. In 1813, the Winslow house passed into the hands of Charles Jackson, a wealthy Plymouth shipowner and merchant. During that time, this room was the likely setting for many social events, as the Jacksons were a prominent family in town. Charles Jackson was married to Lucy Cotton, and together they raised 3 children. Sadly, neither Charles nor Lucy lived to see old age, meeting their ends within months of one another in 1818. The house then passed to their heirs. The Jackson children, Lucy, Lydia, and Charles Thomas, each at one time or another in their lives, resided at this home on North Street, and Lydia, in 1832, referred to it as our great castle, the Winslow House. In 1835, this room was the setting for the wedding of Lydia Jackson to the well-known transcendentalist philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Their first meeting is said to have taken place at tea in Plymouth, and Emerson later described Lydia as a person of noble character, whom to see is to respect, and in Plymouth she is dearly prized for her love and good works. Prior to their engagement, Lydia had a vision of herself dressed as a bride and walking down the steps of the Winslow house with Emerson to be married. Sometime later, another vision came to her in which she beheld Emerson's face gazing at her. Quite serendipitously, the next afternoon, Lydia received a letter from him proposing marriage. I obey my highest impulses in declaring to you the feeling of deep and tender respect with which you have inspired me. Can I resist the impulse to beseech you to love me? Say to me, therefore, anything but no. Demand any time for conversation, for consideration, and I will come to Plymouth with a joyful heart. And so God bless you, dear and blessed maiden, and incline you to love your true friend. After a nearly 9-month engagement, Lydia and Emerson were married on the 14th of September, 1835. And just as Lydia had envisioned, they descended the steps of the Winslow house together. She wore an 11-year-old white muslin dress, whose sleeves had been updated for the occasion, and no veil or flowers, but in her hair was a hand-carved tortoiseshell comb. After their marriage, Lydia followed Emerson to Concord, Massachusetts, where they set up housekeeping in an estate they named Bush. They had 4 children, and Lydia died there in 1892. Charles Thomas, the youngest Jackson child, graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1829. Later described as a distinguished son of Plymouth, he maintained a medical practice, served as a geologist for Maine, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, and claimed to have first given Samuel Morse the idea for the telegraph. However, Jackson would be best known for his part in the discovery of the potential uses of ether as an anesthetic. Whether Jackson was the first to discover ether's anesthetic properties is something that will likely never be known. But what is known is that he was not the first to publicly demonstrate its surgical use. That honor belonged to a dentist named William T.G. Morton. In 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital, Morton performed the first successful medical procedure using ether. However, not long after Morton's triumph, Jackson claimed that he had actually been experimenting with the chemical and its ability to dull pain long prior to Morton's demonstration. In fact, Jackson asserted that he had first instructed Morton on the properties of ether and its potential for use in surgery. This led to a long, contentious feud that was never truly resolved. In 1847, several physicians from Massachusetts General Hospital wrote that Jackson's had contrived, planned, and directed what Dr. Morton's hand executed. And a few short years later, the French Academy of Sciences reached a similar decision and chose to award medals and cash prizes to both men. The medal is pictured here. Whatever the truth may be, family legend claims that Jackson made his initial experiments with the inhalation of ether in this house. In 1872, the Jackson family sold the house to Lucia J. Briggs, the wife of Reverend Dr. George W. Briggs. Lucia originally hailed from Plymouth and was the sister of Dr. Russell and Mary Howland Russell, both of whom stood as witnesses to the wedding of Lydia Jackson and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Her husband, Reverend Dr. George Briggs, was formerly an associate minister at the First Parish Church in Plymouth. In 1897, their son, George Russell Briggs, opened the doors of the house to the public as part of Plymouth's summer celebrations. The house must have been something of a mystery to the townspeople at the time, as a Boston paper wrote of the event, "Within these walls, now gazed at with the curious eyes of the summer excursionist, many a stately dame and courtly squire have walked through the minuet to the music of the old-time spinet." Around 1898, the Winslow house underwent a major renovation when it was purchased by Chicago businessman Charles Willoughby. A wealthy merchant and real estate investor, Willoughby built this room as his library. It is paneled in Honduran mahogany and features a molded ceiling with rose, lily, and mulberry motif. Originally from New England, Charles Willoughby made a name for himself in Chicago, partnering with David K. Hill to form Willoughby Hill & Company. Under this name, they established a well-known Chicago clothier and became proprietors of a popular Chicago restaurant, the Boston Oyster House. The Willoughby family had summered in Plymouth for many years prior to purchasing the Winslow house, and a local newspaper once wrote of Abby Willoughby, Charles's wife, that her health has been precarious for years, but she's always much better when at Plymouth, breathing the invigorating sea breezes from the bay. In 1890, Willoughby purchased a popular resort and many of the surrounding cottages on Plymouth Beach. Sadly, though, in 1897 and 1898, a series of severe storms rendered the entire Plymouth Beach property uninhabitable, leaving Willoughby to focus solely upon the restoration of his newly acquired property on North Street. Upon purchase of the Winslow house in 1898, in order to perform an extensive renovation, Charles Willoughby hired architect Joseph Everett Chandler. Chandler was an authority on the restoration of old New England houses and author of several books on the subject. He's also known for his work on the House of the Seven Gables in Salem, the Paul Revere House in Boston, and the Old South Meeting House in Boston. This was not the first renovation to the house, however, and in making room for the new additions, Chandler demolished 2 wings which had been built after 1754. While removing the L on the north side of the house, a board was uncovered upon which was painted, "Built by William Drew, 1820." Therefore, it's been reasonably assumed that some work was done on the house at that time. Unfortunately, that board and a few written accounts are all that's left of those earlier additions. And the structure we see today is chiefly the product of Chandler and Willoughby's collaboration. Under Chandler's supervision, the house was moved back 30 feet and raised up 5. Side doors, new rooms, and a cupola were added. Yet despite all these changes, Chandler insisted that the original structure of the house be maintained, and that details such as the 18th century wood paneling be preserved. He also saw to it that new items such as windows, inner shutters, and paneling were in keeping with the original structure. Although considerable effort was made to preserve much of the original house during Charles Willoughby's 1898 renovations, it seems that Joseph Everett Chandler's vision for the home and his clients did not always match. In some of his writings, Chandler admitted that there were alterations made which he would rather not have done. On account of the proximity of the house to 2 fine old linden trees, the house was moved back 30 feet and raised 5 feet. Then the addition of 2 wings of an area equal to the old house necessitated other changes until the character of the house became considerably changed. Although the finish in the additions, inside and out, was made in the spirit and period of the old, the doorway has an interesting frieze of turkeys, vines, grapes, and flowers, looking like a curious mixture of a copy from old Byzantine work and a piece of old embroidery. I kept the doorframe exactly as it was, hoping it would remain so many years. But just as the house was nearing completion, my client announced that he must have a covered porch. So I reluctantly added one. Cycloramas are massive panoramic oil paintings which were a popular form of entertainment in the second half of the 19th century. They were often displayed in special auditoriums and enhanced with foregrounds of landscaping and life-sized figures, allowing visitors to seemingly step inside of the scene. Most cycloramas depicted significant historical events, such as battles or scenes from classic works of literature. Around 1879, a group of Chicago businessmen commissioned a cyclorama of the Battle of Gettysburg to be painted by French artist Paul-Philippe Otto. It opened to the public in Chicago in 1883 and received such accolades that another version was immediately commissioned to be displayed in Boston. Charles Willoughby was the sole owner of the Boston Cyclorama and had an elaborate building constructed on Tremont Street for its exhibit. After several years of display, the painting was removed and was eventually purchased by the National Park Service. The cyclorama, 377 feet long, 42 feet high, and weighing 12.5 tons, was recently restored and is now on display at the Gettysburg National Military Park Visitor Center in Pennsylvania. The Boston Cyclorama building still stands on Tremont Street and is part of the Boston Center for the Arts. The man behind the 1898 Winslow House restorations, famed architect Joseph Everett Chandler, created a Colonial revival garden for Mrs. Willoughby. These photos showcase the garden in the early 20th century. The image on the top is a newspaper announcement from August 1928 for a tea to be held at the Willoughby home, and the one below shows the garden in 1930. Teas and garden parties were a common source of entertainment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the Willoughbys likely hosted many of these at their Plymouth home. In her 1922 etiquette book, Emily Post wrote,
"The garden party is merely an afternoon tea out of doors. It may be as elaborate as a sit-down wedding breakfast or as simple as a miniature strawberry festival. At an elaborate one, a tent with a good dancing floor is often put up on the lawn. The orchestra is placed within or near open sides of the tent, so that it can be heard on the lawn and veranda as well as where they're dancing. On the lawn there are usually several huge bright-colored umbrella tents, and under each a table and a group of chairs. In addition to hot tea and chocolate, there is either iced coffee or a very melted café parfait or frosted chocolate in cups. There are also pitchers of various drinks that have rather mysterious ingredients, but are all very much iced and embellished with crushed fruits and mint leaves. There are often berries with cream as well as the inevitable array of fancy sandwiches and cakes.
Part of the 1898 addition to the house, this space served as a formal dining room for the Willoughby family. It is paneled in Honduran mahogany, and the built-in walnut cabinets contain dinnerware from the 19th and early 20th centuries. The wealthy elite at the turn of the century spent much of their time attending or hosting social events. Among the more common activities were teas, garden parties, balls, dinner parties, and supper parties. The Willoughbys likely held many such affairs at their house in Plymouth, including dinners and suppers in this very dining room. Dinner parties at the turn of the century were often lavish affairs with multiple courses. In an 1898 etiquette book, a typical dinner menu was said to include hors d'oeuvres, 2 kinds of soup, fish and bread, a joint, game or poultry, vegetables, gravies and sauces, cheeses, sweets, and savories. In addition, each course featured a different wine or liqueur, but many etiquette books of the time warned against drunkenness and hailed moderation. In fact, moderation was encouraged in all things, and readers were advised that they need not sample every dish on a dinner menu. Through the swinging doors is the 1898 butler's pantry. A butler's pantry, or serving pantry, is a dedicated space in a large home for storage of serving items. That means that this space was used for storing, counting, and polishing the family silver. A fun fact, butlers often slept in the pantry, as their job was to keep the silver under lock and key. The butler for the Willoughby family may not have slept in this pantry though, as there's a private apartment above the kitchen area that was used as servants' quarters. In early America, servants typically dined, slept, and worked amongst their employers. But by the late 17th century, things began to change. It became more common for affluent families to build space specifically for their servants, presumably in part because having their living space separated would improve privacy for both parties, while also keeping cooking smells, noise, and any other delicacies of the lower class away from their employers. The room beyond was the kitchen at the time of the Willoughby's residence. It is now a lounge provided for our society members. The servants' quarters, located directly above, are now a private apartment used by members of the Mayflower Society and visiting scholars as a place to stay when in town. One of the house's most striking features is the flying staircase. The flights of stairs closest to the main entryway are original to the 1754 house, and at that time abutted the outside wall. When Charles Willoughby purchased the house in 1898, as part of his expansions, he had them duplicated on the other side. The 2 rooms on either side of you are original to the 1754 house, and despite the many renovations to the house over the years, each retains 18th century wood paneling. In addition, both rooms feature a fireplace adorned with Delft tiles. The blue bedroom may have originally belonged to the Winslow children. Although the Winslows had 5, only 3 children survived infancy: Penelope, Sarah, and Edward. During the Revolutionary War, Penelope and Sarah joined their parents when they fled Plymouth and later New York City to eventually settle in Canada. They both lived the remainder of their lives there and died unmarried. Edward spent the duration of the war fighting for the British, and following their defeat, joined the rest of his family in Canada. The Jacobean bedroom across the hall may have originally served as sleeping quarters for Edward Winslow and his wife Hannah. It now contains some of the oldest furniture in our collection. The ornate bed in the center of the room is thought to date back to the 17th century. It's heavy, strong, and extremely durable, as was typical of furniture at that time. It's different from modern beds in that the mattress is supported by ropes, which form a grid in between the side rails. These ropes would need to be tightened periodically to prevent the mattress from sagging. The oak cupboard to the right of the bed has a flat top and overhanging ornate carved frieze featuring the date 1670. In 1648, such cupboards were described as being for cups and glasses to drink in, spoons, sugar box, vial, and crucis for vinegar, oil, and mustard pot. This piece was donated by the Massachusetts Society of Mayflower Descendants. The chest in the corner was constructed in Marshfield, Massachusetts, around 1698. It's made of oak and pine, and an A, an S, and a B are carved into it. This type of chest would have been used for storage, often containing items such as bed linens or clothing. In 1979, this piece of furniture was featured in a special exhibit titled Craftsmen and Community, the 17th Century Furniture of Southeastern New England. This bedroom is part of the Willoughby era addition and is said to have belonged to Grace, Mr. and Mrs. Willoughby's only child. The paneling is made of sycamore, a shade tree with reddish-brown wood. In the 19th and 20th century, making a good marriage was the most important, if not the only goal, of upper-class girls. To this end, they would become well-versed in the social graces and spent much of their time learning feminine accomplishments or skills that were considered necessary for a well-bred woman, such as needlework, playing an instrument, singing, drawing, dancing, reading, writing, and speaking and reading other languages such as Italian or French. The Ladies' Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness, one of many such instructional books written in the 19th century, had this to say to young women.
In the present age, when education is within the reach of all, both rich and poor, every lady will endeavor to become not only well educated, but accomplished. It is not, as some will assert, a waste of time or money. No woman is fitted for society until she dances well, for home, unless she is perfect mistress of needlework, for her own enjoyment, unless she has at least one accomplishment to occupy thoughts and fingers in her hours of leisure.
One necessary accomplishment or skill ladies at that time were expected to have was needlework. As a demonstration or test of their skills at this art, girls would make samplers like the cross-stitched one seen here. These samplers might include the alphabet, a Bible verse or other quote, a decorative border, human or animal figures, and the name of the needlewoman and the date wrought. After Charles Willoughby's death in 1919, his wife Abby and daughter Grace continued improvements to the estate. Adjoining houses were purchased and raised, improving the view of Plymouth Rock and the ocean, and the land was added to the already extensive garden. To protect the grounds from the elements and the public, a 6-foot red brick wall was erected along the south and east sides of the estate, and in 1930, the solarium, the bright and airy room off of the library, was added to the house. Pictured here is a view of Plymouth Harbor from Winslow Street during the early 20th century. Some years after her mother's death, Grace Willoughby offered the property for sale, and in 1941 it was purchased by the General Society of Mayflower descendants. The name was changed from the Winslow House to the Mayflower Society House, and it became the national headquarters for the society. In December 1941, just as America was entering World War II, the house became the property of the General Society of Mayflower descendants. It was then turned over to the Plymouth chapter of the Red Cross and served as their local headquarters for the duration of the war. During the Second World War, the Red Cross provided services to the U.S. military, their allies, and civilian war victims. They prepared packages for American and Allied prisoners of war, delivered messages to loved ones fighting overseas, shipped supplies overseas, and initiated a national blood program that collected millions of pints of blood for use by the armed forces. In February 1943, Mayflower Society member Adelaide Newell Meek, a leading advocate for the purchase of the house, received a letter from a close friend describing the atmosphere at the Winslow House while it was in use by the Red Cross.
As I entered the beautiful front door, the whole house lighted. 4 young junior Red Cross girls in their white uniforms were coming down the stairs, their veils floating behind them. Such a pretty sight. Later, they helped in the canteen. A radio in the distance was playing Onward Christian Soldiers. I stopped. I was really quite overcome. All over the house, the women in the Red Cross uniforms of the various departments. An official from Washington was there. He was so impressed with the whole thing. I had a long talk with him during the evening. He said that the Society of Mayflower descendants could never understand or realize what they had done in giving the house over to us.
This room was built as part of Charles Willoughby's 1898 renovations and is paneled in cherry wood. After the General Society of Mayflower descendants acquired the house, it became known as the Governor General's Room, so named for the person who serves as the leader of the organization. The first Society of Mayflower descendants was established in New York in 1894. 3 more states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, followed suit in 1896. In 1897, all 4 state societies joined to form the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, or GSMD. Soon, societies began to form all over the nation and can now be found in each of the 50 states and Canada. Most recently, societies were added in Europe and the UK, and efforts are underway to form societies in Australia and the Netherlands. To date, the General Society has accepted over 200,000 lineages and boasts a membership of almost 30,000 descendants. To belong to the society, you must prove your lineage from one of the 102 passengers who traveled across the Atlantic on the Mayflower in the year 1620. Our Colonial Revival Garden is the popular site of summer strolls and intimate weddings for all who appreciate this unique beauty hidden in downtown Plymouth. Originally established by the affluent Willoughby family in the late 1800s, the garden is now the relaxing centerpiece of the GSMD headquarters. Within the garden, you'll see a concrete replica of the coat of arms of Great Britain for 1714 to 1801. This was the centerpiece of the balustrade on the Mayflower Society House roof, placed there by Charles Willoughby in honor of the house's original owner, Loyalist Edward Winslow. Along with the balustrade, it was removed in 2017 and is now preserved in our garden. In 2011, the General Society of Mayflower descendants created the Garden Walkway fundraising project. Since inception, multiple new pathways of engraved bricks have been installed. We encourage members and friends to enjoy our walkway and the many bricks that celebrate, honor, and memorialize Pilgrim families. Speak to our development office in the administration building for more information. The Mayflower Society also owns the 2 buildings to the back of the lot. The images show these 2 buildings in 1951. During the Willoughby-era restorations, one of the old kitchens was removed from the house and relocated to the back of the property. It was then transformed into a tea house, and a new greenhouse was attached. After the society acquired the property, the tea house was renovated, and the greenhouse was torn down and replaced by a new addition. This structure is now our research library and the offices of our genealogy and research staff, where applications to the General Society are verified. The library is open to the public Monday through Friday and contains invaluable research materials pertaining to Mayflower Pilgrim ancestry. The building on the left is our administration building, where the day-to-day operations of the General Society take place. It was built as a 5-car garage by Mrs. Willoughby after her husband's death, and was arranged in a manner which allowed it to also serve as a theater for charity events. In addition, living quarters were built on the 2nd floor for the gardener and his family. It has been estimated that, in the United States alone, there are over 10 million people descended from Mayflower passengers. Could you be one of them? With advanced research techniques, improved genealogical library collections, and digitized resources, it is now easier than ever to track down your Pilgrim roots. An application to the General Society of Mayflower Descendants is submitted through one of 53 member societies in the United States, Canada, and Europe, and their contact information can be found on our website at themayflowersociety.org. If you think you may have discovered a Mayflower ancestor in your family tree, you may want to submit a preliminary review request to GSMD. This review is not an application, but rather an opportunity to find out if others who share your lineage from a Mayflower passenger have already provided records which may assist you in proving your own line of descent. More than 200,000 distinct lineages and the complete collection of our Mayflower Families publications are referenced during the preliminary review process. When you think you've gathered sufficient evidence to support your proposed lineage, such as birth, marriage, and death certificates, or other types of documentation, contact the state society of your choice, and they will direct you in the preparation of your application. For more information, or to ask research questions, please visit our research library at the rear of the garden. Thank you for visiting the Mayflower Society House. We hope you enjoyed your tour.